thanks for having me here. A bit of a background on this paper. So when last year James was inviting me for to present some topic, I had this paper in mind, and at that stage this was at R&R at American Journal of Agricultural Economics. Between then and now, it has got accepted. So apologies to present something that's already been accepted, but Maxim thought it's a good idea for some of our brilliant PhD students to see how the process goes, what are the key comments. I'd be happy to answer in detail after the seminar as well on the process and how to handle the referee comments, especially at AJAE. Ken obviously has presented a brilliant paper at AJAE as well. So you can discuss things with him as well. And please feel free to ask any questions in between. No need to keep questions and comments till the end. I'll be done in 20 minutes otherwise. So let's get started. Okay. So what's the motivation of this analysis? Well, the idea is that if you look at welfare programs, not just in India, but in generally in developing economies, they're implemented for a variety of reasons. It can be because you want to handle underemployment. It can be because you want to subsidize some basic investment goods. It can be just cash transfers. It can be some kind of conditional cash transfers, etc. So there are a lot of reasons why welfare programs are implemented in developing economies. And the key question that this paper asks is whether spending in transfer programs can have consequential effect on the economic activity. Okay, why is this important? Well, this is important because if you look at this paper, this is a very nice paper by Hyun-Sung Oh and Ricardo Rice. It was published in the Journal of Monetary Economics in 2012. And what they say is that during the financial crisis between 2007 and 2009, in the US, more than 75% of the increase in government expenditures was transfer spending. And it was pretty much the same in most of the OECD economies as well, where this statistic is around 64%. And now if you're wondering that, this is obvious because when there's a spike in unemployment, then automatic stabilizers mean that government is spending more on unemployment benefits, then you'd be wrong. Because, again, this paper shows that more than half of the increase in expenditure was discretionary. In other words, the government was spending intentionally more through transfer programs. And there's a bit of a disconnect between what was happening in reality and what was being reflected in research, because a lot of papers at that time were understanding the multiplier effect of government purchases. Well, as you can see, most of it was not government purchases, it was government transfers. And India is no different, because this was there in the Review of Economy report in India, 2008. It said, in the prevailing situation, speedy implementation of already funded projects at the central and state level is important for the fast revival of the economy. What's the idea? The idea is that if you want to administer new purchase programs, then that's a long process with a lot of lags. You have to get approvals from the lower house, the upper house, etc. While an easy way out to inject funds into the system is to inject them through already existing welfare schemes. You just inject more, and that's a fiscal stimulus. So it's easy. And that essentially was the basis of this paper. What we wanted to ask is whether social transfers are meaningful as far as an instrument for fiscal stimulus is concerned. Okay, that's the basis. What's the related literature? Well, the related literature on this aspect basically can be divided in three categories. And the idea is basically emanating from identification. How do you identify the the effect of government expenditure on economic activity, because these two things are highly endogenous, right? You want to be spending more, but you might be just spending more because you're having a recession. So how do you disentangle what the effect of government spending is on economic activity? And there are three key ways the literature has done that. One is the structural wars or vector autoregressions, where some seminal papers like Blanchard and Perotti, Mountford and Uhlig, Ilzetsky, Mendoza and Weg, they all work with structural var errors. That's one way to go about it, but it entails making some strong assumptions regarding the short-run errors and the long-run errors and how they're correlated with each other. The second strand, obviously, is instrumental variables, which is most used in economics. And the idea here is that you find some other source of exogenous variation in the contended X variable or the endogenous variable. And there are some nice papers by Conchia, Corsetti, and Simonelli in 2014. This was published in AER, Nakamura and Steinson. I think even this got published in AER. And there are a bunch of other papers as well that use instrumental variables approach to identify the effect of government spending in general on economic activity, not necessarily transfers. And the final bit is narrative analysis. So this is another important contribution of this paper and a bunch of these papers, is that we are trying to motivate another strand or another way of identifying exogenous variation, and that is through narrative analysis. Some seminal papers are by Barrow, Rame and Shapiro, Romer and Romer. What's the idea? The idea is quite simple. You look at narrative records, these can be government records, published reports, etc., that define exact reasons why a policy change was made. Okay? And if you have that information, then you can understand whether the change in government policy, whether it was an increase or decrease in taxes, increase or decrease in government expenditure, was due to endogenous reasons or more structural long-term reasons. And say, for example, in the paper by Romer and Romer, they analyzed the 2010 paper, they analyzed the effect of tax changes on economic activity. And what they said was that, okay, so we will distinguish tax changes that were made due to immediate output concerns or tax changes that were made due to long-term growth concerns or structural reasons. The long-term changes are essentially categorized as being independent of immediate or prospective fluctuations in output, hence exogenous. Okay? So this is essentially the route that this paper will take. We will go through a narrative analysis approach to disentangle exogenous variations in transfer spending at the state level. Okay, so what does this paper do? Well, to begin with, we estimate local multipliers that correspond to spending in rural welfare programs. And when I say local multipliers, what do I mean? Well, by local, I mean state-specific multiplier. That's what I mean by local. By multiplier, I mean by what dollar amount does the economic activity in that area increase when you inject $1 of transfer spending. Okay, so if the economic activity increases by $2, we'll have a multiplier of 2. Okay, this is very closely related with the Keynesian multiplier, but there are many channels that can explain this. Any questions up till now? No? Okay.
So it's the impact so these things become more and more narrow as the base in the state becomes narrow. Is that what's happening when you say state level multiplier? The impact of this spending nationally was more than what happened in the state?
Not necessarily. What we're trying to understand here is what's the effect of you spending $1 in one state as opposed to you spending $1 nationally. because when you're spending $1 nationally, there are a lot of other factors that you cannot control for, like monetary policy, agricultural policy, tax policy, fiscal policy, etc. When you're dealing with local areas like states, you have a lot of maneuverability in terms of controlling for a lot of factors at the national level, and then look at what exactly was happening at the state. One is not necessarily smaller or bigger than the other, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I'm asking whether it's the industry structure in the state. So if this spending spills out into other states, you're capturing...
Oh yes, I'll talk about spillovers.
Yeah.
But to break the suspense, we find no spillovers. Yeah. Either spatially or regionally, both sectorally and spatially. Yeah.
There's a debate in the PR literature as to what the magnitude of the government spending multiplier is, whether it's greater than 1, whether it's less than 1. And you have all sorts of like bands, like you go like anywhere between -1 and 2, for example. So that's my understanding that that's the national level. So is it better that you use local multipliers that can be better identified in terms of controlling things that you say, or is there any such debate in the magnitude of local multiplier?
Yes, so one, I completely agree. There's a big band between which multipliers have been reported, between 0, even minus, and greater than 1. Again, I wouldn't say necessarily which one is more policy relevant, whether it's the local multiplier or the national multiplier. It depends upon the question you're trying to ask. The question we are trying to ask here is essentially, how can fiscal policy, or welfare policy in this case, take care of local disturbances in the rural areas, because the things that we'll be talking about are essentially rural welfare programs. So what we are essentially trying to address is how can you at all make significant changes to a local shock as opposed to a national shock. Does that make sense? But obviously, some of the papers that I mentioned earlier estimate multipliers at the national level. So that's pertaining to the fact that do you want to address questions related to aggregate output. Out here, we are more focused on local output, but the results are quite similar. Anything else? Yeah.
How much room for manoeuvre do the states have in India? Is welfare policy set nationally, or is it set at the state level?
That's a good question. Actually, that is essentially what we will use to identify our exogenous variation, and it's set nationally. States don't really have a say in designing nationwide welfare programs. Anything else? No? Okay. What do? We construct a novel panel data of rural social transfer spending at the state level from 1980 to 2010. It spans 30 years. And we take 10 major rural development programs or welfare programs between these 30 years. When we say major rural welfare programs, what we mean is national programs that covered all the states in the country, not state-specific programs. So, for example, there was one very famous employment guarantee program in the state of Maharashtra. We don't consider that because that's just one state-specific program. We're more concerned about national programs. And what we do is we use narrative analysis to construct exogenous variation in transfer spending due to the introduction of a program. That's the key. We use introductions of new programs as a spike in expenditure and use that as exogenous variation in calculating what the multiplier is. And we use this measure to estimate transfer spending multipliers for agricultural output at state level. Now, why suddenly agricultural output at state level? Well, one, because as we will discuss later, these programs were specifically aimed at rural areas in a state, not urban areas. And ideally, what we would want is to have a measure of rural income at the state level. We don't have that. What's the next best thing? We look at agricultural output, value added. But the idea also is motivated from the fact that if you look at the agricultural sector in India, it actually represents economic activity pretty well. So on the left-hand side, you can see this is showing the size of rural employment in agriculture. And that's pretty much close to 75–80% for most of the sample. So what this essentially is showing you that, at least in the rural areas, agriculture is the predominant sector. So we will be capturing most of the first-order effects. On the right-hand side, we can see that we're showing as a percent of national GDP what was the share of agricultural output. And again, you can see for most of the sample, it has been greater than 25%. So that's again a very substantial share of the total output, although it has been declining and it will continue to do so like any emerging economy. But at least in our sample, the share is pretty large. So that's the rationale for focusing on agricultural output at state level. So what we want to understand is what happens when the government spends $1 in a state through these rural welfare programs. What is the effect in, again, dollar terms on agricultural output, okay, of that state? Okay, so let's get to narrative analysis. Yeah. So what are our data and what are the sources and what are the kind of information that we can extract from these government records? So to begin with, what we use is annual reports, various annual issues from the Ministry of Rural Development and Planning Commission. And essentially what these reports say is that they detail the kind of welfare programs that were active in a particular year. They tell you the objective of that program, why it was implemented. They tell you what was the rationale of implementing it. They give you the type of program, whether it's an employment guarantee program or a credit or a subsidy program. You also have information on the date of implementation, principal motivation, and whether it was implemented in a phase-wise manner. That's another thing. Sometimes some programs, like the most recent National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which is the largest workfare program in the world, was implemented in phases because it's too big to be implemented all at once. So they implemented in phases. And we also know, what we also get is state-wise annual expenditure data from annual financial statements or progress reports. This is essentially where we have extracted our data from. These are old pages. I wish I would have attached a photo of that, old pages, and this was manually entered. Long process, painful process. And in the end, what we have is panel data of 23 states for 30 years. In total, 690 observations. A bit about these programs. As I said, all major centrally sponsored rural welfare programs were taken since 1980. There are two broad categories between these programs. The first is an employment program in which essentially the government pays you minimum wage in return for some manual labor that may be used to construct some productive public infrastructure in the rural economy, like building a school, or not really building a school, but basically mostly related to agricultural activities, like building a dam or building a, for soil and moisture conservation, etc. These kind of activities, flood protection, etc., etc. So you do all these things that are not essentially infrastructure driven, but mostly non-marketable goods and services. All schemes cover only the rural regions of the state, and direct financial assistance to rural poor is the priority, not creation of marketable goods and services. And the scheme follows a well-structured fund allocation process. What we mean by that is that once the central government decides that this is the program that we are going to implement, then funds are allocated to different states, usually based on the number of rural poor in that state and some of the metrics like how backward that state is and how bad the agricultural situation in that state is, etc., etc. And then you allocate the funds to the state, and then the states do the expenditure. Any questions up till now? Okay. These are the programs that we consider. You don't have to bother about the acronyms, but essentially this is the program name. This is showing you the years when a program was active, the type of program, whether it was a credit or a subsidy program or a welfare program. And this column is showing you whether it replaced any previous programs. So for example, when JRY was introduced in 1989, it replaced previous two programs, NREP and RLEGP. Okay? Similarly, when NREGA was implemented in 2006, it replaced the previous employment program, which is SGRY. Out here, we are informing whether these programs were implemented in a phase-wise manner. And finally, we are giving average annual expenditure in 2004 prices in these programs. Essentially, these are the total programs that we consider, except that whatever we are considering, for each program, we'll have a state-wise expenditure information during the years that it is active. Yep, hold on. Yep. This graph shows you the aggregate annual variations in rural transfer spending. So let me explain this in a bit more detail. We have year on the x-axis, states on the y-axis, and percent of state agricultural output on the z-axis. What do we define as total rural spending, first of all? So total rural spending is the total spending in a state where we add up all the program expenditure for all the active programs in a particular year. Okay, so that's total rural spending for a particular state in a particular year. And that is a broader measure of transfer spending because that essentially is encapsulating everything, right? Old programs, new programs, whatever. And when we take the year-on-year change in that total rural spending, that is essentially what we call as the broader measure of changes in transfer spending. Why are we discussing this? Well, we are discussing this because precisely these changes, quite a lot of these changes can be endogenous, right? Some of the spikes that you're seeing here might just be because in a already implemented program, the state of Andhra Pradesh suffered a drought or a flood or something, and to assist that particular state, the government injected more funds, right? So this is endogenous. If you regress this, if you regress output, agricultural output on this series, you'll get things that are spurious, biased. But it's useful nonetheless. Any questions? Okay. What's the identifying motivation? Now, our identifying motivation is as follows. We use state-level fluctuations in transfer spending during the implementation of a new nationwide program that is not motivated by current or prospective fluctuations in local output. Okay. I'll explain the identification strategy in the next slide as well, but what we use is official government records as narrative evidence to identify principal motivation for the introduction of a new program. And what we find is that a new program is largely implemented out of one of these two reasons. The first is that a new program is implemented to replace old schemes to address past inefficiencies. So for example, in the year 1995, the annual report of the Ministry of Rural Development will say, okay, we implemented these two programs from 1980s. What we are realizing is they're not working well in terms of who they should target, in terms of the screening mechanism, et cetera, What we have decided is that we are going to close these things and we are implementing a new program which takes the features of these previous programs but improves on the deficiencies or inefficiencies of the previous programs. That's one issue. So you're implementing a nationwide program not because there's some problem in particular state or a particular local issue, but because in general you identified there was a problem with the older programs.
So the assumption that because it's a national level decision, it's exogenous
Yes.
Things
Yes.
and then into the rest of the state.
Yeah. Yeah. The second is that a new program is implemented to address a deep-rooted socio-economic issue not addressed before. So again, the example is that in the year 1981, the government of India said, okay, we need to do something about landless laborers in rural areas because they are the ones most affected by climate shocks, droughts, etc. We need to do something specifically for them. Now, if you ask, wasn't this a problem before? It was. But as is the case in emerging economies, things come up sporadically. You identify, okay, there's an issue, we need to do something, and let's do something about it. So that's the second example. There's a problem, and suddenly the government says, okay, we need to do something about this. Again, it was in response to a problem, but not in response to a local problem. Okay, it was not in response to some issue happening in Punjab or Haryana. It was just in response to a deep-rooted issue that was always there, but you just decided you need to do something about it.
So you mean always there nationwide or always there in a particular?
Always there nationwide. The problem of landless unemployment was always there. It's not a state-specific feature. It's always there, but just that when you have enough budget, etc., you decide, okay, we need to do something specifically for them. And when you do this, you're not implementing the program because there's a problem of landless unemployment in the state of Punjab. You're doing this because it's a generic problem. That's why it's a nationwide program. Otherwise, the state of Punjab would have done something about it.
Still, when defining the budget, the national government takes into account this difference in the employment rate of each state in order to allocate the budget.
Come again?
I mean, once a program has been approved, they are implementing it. When they decide the budget for each state, this program, they take into account, for instance, the employment rate of each state.
What they usually take into account, the most important variable that they take into account is the ratio of a rural poor in a state to the total rural poor in the country. That's the most important metric that they have in mind. And we'll see that the shock series that we'll construct is quite orthogonal to these features. In fact, again, to break the suspense, the regressions that we do control for state fixed effects, year fixed effects, blah, blah, blah. But if we really think our shock series is exogenous to output growth, etc., then our results shouldn't change much even if we drop these fixed effects. And that's exactly what we see as well. And that's very important. So if you're really motivating something as exogenous, it shouldn't matter whether you're having fixed effects or not. The assumption here is that the key identifying assumption here is that the introduction of a new program is largely independent of the current or prospective output fluctuations. In other words, the government does not introduce a new scheme because the states that spend a greater amount of program funds during the year of implementation are doing poorly relative to others. This is very similar to the assumption of military spending in the US by Nakamura and Steinson, but they are using a much more stronger assumption. They are using changes in military spending across the board all over the years. While what we are concerned about is that may not be true once the program is well implemented into the system. So our measure of shock is only pertaining to the year in which the program is implemented. That's it, not after that. Okay? Once a program is well into the system, then changes in program spending can in fact be endogenous to the system. And this is in fact also noted in the annual plan document of Ministry of Rural Development. It states that to the extent the growth process will bypass certain sections of the rural society, it will be necessary to provide supplementary employment and incomes via special programs. What's the idea? The idea here is that the objective is precisely not output growth. The objective is something else. It's these deeply rooted issues that they want to tackle. So it clearly is quite independent of prospective output fluctuations or current output fluctuations. which helps our case, yes.
So is it that they implement a program in the States, they don't know what it will do, and then they learn, oh, it's falling short,
Pretty much.
and then expenditure becomes endogenous?
Pretty much. Pretty much. Also in the sense that when you're first implementing the program, that happened due to reasons that were quite independent of local conditions. And that's essentially what we are exploiting. What happens when that program is in fact well implemented is altogether a different thing. Because then you know what you're doing, then you know that there's a drought there or a flood there and you need to do something. But the year in which a new program is implemented, it's basically a bonus. You get more spending. Yeah.
So there is a distinction between when this there could be a distinction between when this is declared and when this is implemented, much like any government.
Yeah. So if I have to summarize your comment, it's basically, are you worried about anticipation effects? Am I right? Yeah, we are not. Because, again, there's a whole section on this in the paper. I've not discussed this. But the idea here is that if you look at this paper by Z-Scheme, Mendoza, and Weg, they're discussing that anticipation effects are not particularly a big issue in developing economies where even the state who's implementing the program doesn't have full information about how much it's going to spend, leave alone people or the private sector, where you are expecting that they'll have a better information ex ante, while the government doesn't have that information even ex post. So the expenditure program expenditure figures that I'm having were actually taken after 2 or 3 years after the program was implemented. And there was a big difference between revised estimates and the preliminary estimates. So that's one. The second, obviously, is a more technical thing in the sense that if you look at this very nice paper by Kaplan and Violante, it was published in QJE, they were saying that even rich households have a very large propensity to consume out of transitory income because they are cash poor. Out here, we're talking about really poor households. So anticipation effect. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so once we have identified the fact that the motivation of implementing a program is quite independent to output, how do we actually identify these shocks? Well, the first thing is that we exploit state-level heterogeneity in expenditure during program introduction to construct the narrative shock series. The idea is that these are supply variabilities. These are not related to demand. It's just that some states are better suited, are better geared to implement these programs when they're first implemented, while others are not so much. It can be highly idiosyncratic. That's the key point that has come out of this literature again and again. It can be the civil servant who's at a particular district who's more motivated to implement this program. And after a few years, he'll move to some other district in some other state. So these things can be highly idiosyncratic, which is what we use. The introductory period, the year in which a new program is introduced, is basically what we take as the timing of the shock. Okay? It's the year in which the program is introduced, except for programs that are implemented in phases, which I think are only 2 in our whole sample. So there are only 2 such programs where we take the timing as the shock, as the year in which the program is introduced, and the year after as well, because it was expanded quite substantially next year as well. And what do we take as the introductory variation? It's the year-on-year change in real per capita transfer spending due to the new scheme. Okay? In the case of a new program which is restructured in the sense that it's enveloping older inefficient programs, the way we calculate the size of the shock is by doing new program expenditure in period T for a particular state minus the total expenditure incurred under the previous program in T minus 1. Okay? For a new program that's a standalone program, addressing some deep-rooted issue, deep-rooted socioeconomic issue, we just do new program expenditure in the year of introduction because there's no previous analog. Okay? The idea is if there were previous programs and there's a level of expenditure, and then you just implement a new restructured program, which is usually always having higher expenditure and higher budget outlay, we take the spike, the difference. But if there is a new program altogether which has no previous analog, then you take the whole expenditure as exogenous.
Are all the shocks positive?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Some of the shocks are negative, which is good in our case because we want both to be the case. Although I'll show you the graph and most of them do look positive, but some of them are in fact negative as well. This is the example of a standalone scheme, and there's a 50-page narrative analysis appendix in the paper for any of the interested readers. I'll just show you two examples. One is of a standalone scheme, and we are showing here the Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Program. We know it was implemented in 1983. It was active till 1988. The program expenditure at the national level was 0.27 billion in rupees in 1983, and then it expanded to $14.99 billion by 1984. What's the exogenous change in state level transfers? It's the expenditure in the year 1983 and the difference between 1984 and 1983 because this was implemented in phases. Again, for a state I. So the subscript I essentially refers to state. This is example of a restructure scheme, which was, okay, sure. So should I just quickly end the discussion, or should I continue till whatever 15 minutes that we have and take questions in between? I can do anything.
Finish by 55.
Okay. Okay, cool. We'll do that. So the restructured scheme is Indira Awas Yojana. Here, essentially, this is the narrative evidence that we're using. Is giving you all the information from the program that was earlier associated with, and how the expenditure increased. So we use all of this information to identify what the expenditure was in 1995 minus what the expenditure was in 1994. A case in point is, for example, we know that 6% of the previous program budget in JRY was associated with ARE-UWA. So that's essentially how we estimate what the expenditure in the previous program was, and then we take the difference. How does the shock series look? This is how the shock series looks. And this is what we call as the narrative shock series. It's the exogenous changes in rural transfer spending. Some of them are negative, but you can't see this simply because it's a weirdly angled 3D graph, but there are some negative shocks as well. As you can see, most of the values are 0, and there are only few shocks or few spikes. And every time you see a spike, it's basically the introduction of a new program. What are the properties of this exogenous transfer changes? One, no evidence of serial correlation in the shock series, which is important. There's no systemic correlation with the ratio of rural poor in the state to the total rural poor in the country. Why we want this? Why we want to check this is because this can be endogenous, and if it indeed is a shock series, it shouldn't be. And what we also want to understand is, do a few consecutive bad harvest year or a few negative shocks influence the introduction of a new program at the nation level? And the way we check that is by having lags of the dependent variable to see if they explain shocks, and they don't. I'm not showing this result, but you can believe me, it's true. This is the serial correlation of narrative shock series. As you can see, we're basically showing if it's correlated with the shock series ET and ET minus 1, and they're pretty much orthogonal to each other, which is good because if they are serially correlated, what it essentially means is that previous shocks can be used to predict future shocks. What's our empirical model? YIT is percentage growth in real per capita expenditure output. SIT is the exogenous shock divided by output, agricultural output at a state at a particular point in time. Alpha I and gamma T are state and year fixed effects. RIT is the rural poor in the state divided by the total rural poor in the country. Beta naught would measure the impact multiplier, that is the impact of spending $1 at a state in that particular year. and these are dynamic multipliers, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. So the specification is extremely simple because the hard work is essentially constructing the narrative shock series. What are the results? Well, the result is as follows. This is showing you the estimated impact of a transfer increase of 1% of state agricultural output on state agricultural output using exogenous changes. Okay? And on impact, we see the effect is close to 1.4. The multiplier is 1.4, which is to say that if you spend $1, you get $1.4 increase in agricultural output at local level, which is quite substantial, to be honest. And this grows to close to 2 by the end of 5 years. Now, a key point that we want to understand is, okay, so this is basically what it is, but how does this compare with the broader measure of transfer spending changes that I showed you earlier? What happens when I replace this shock series with the broader measure of transfer spending changes, right? I think this is self-explanatory and shows what endogeneity and biased results can do. This is insignificantly different from 0, and the magnitude actually is an order of magnitude smaller than the impact estimated with exogenous changes. So that's one key point. The second, obviously, is, so when I submitted this paper, the referees quite liked it, except they were saying, so, okay, we buy the fact that there is some effect on agricultural output. How do you explain it? What's the mechanism? And the first mechanism, obviously, is the fact that if you do transfer spending, you have demand effects. But if there are only demand effects and there is no supply effect, then we know, economics 101, there's an increase in prices, not output, right? So there has to be some supply side effects as well. And the mechanism was that, yes, because you do these public works, you do increase agricultural productivity by doing soil and moisture conservation, flood protection, etc., but that is essentially what they wanted me to show. And that is what I gave them. This table is essentially showing you the mechanism in terms of productivity growth. And CI is the cropping intensity, which is defined as gross cropped area divided by net sown area. And what we are showing in the first row is that this channel is a potent channel. That is, if there's an increase in cropping intensity, it does increase output growth. Okay? So that's once that is done, what we want to next see is what is the effect of the shock series on cropping intensity. And what we find is that in the first 2 years, there's not much happening. But in the second year, a shock causes 5% increase in cropping intensity by the end of 2 years. And that's, again, sensible in the sense that supply shocks or supply improvements don't happen immediately. So, for example, if you create channels from a river to the field, it usually takes a year and a half, etc., to actually make them functional. So that's essentially the spike that we get after 2 years. Again, worth contrasting this with the broader measure of transfer spending changes. That is, we regress cropping intensity on the broader measure of transfer spending changes. And the key point is, again, to compare the magnitudes here, which are, again, there's an order of magnitude difference between the two. In the last two rows, what we're doing is essentially mediation analysis. What we want to show is when we're computing these multipliers, what happens when we compute the multipliers without the mediator variable and with the mediator variable. So without the mediator variable is precisely what I showed you in the graph earlier. Close to 1.4 on impact, increases to 2.1 by 5 years. But with the mediator variable, the first two don't really change as much, but there's a big drop in the third multiplier at the t+2 stage. And that's, again, consistent with the fact that most of the multiplier is explained with this 5% increase into CI. If you multiply these two things, it's basically 1.2. So what it's saying is that CIT explains 1.2 of the multiplier in the third year. And consistently, after the third year onwards, this multiplier is 30 to 40% lower than in the specification without CIT. So essentially what we are saying is that after the second year, the productivity mechanisms do explain a substantial proportion of the multiplier. Question, yes?
That's sort of like what explains the dynamic multiplier, but you've also shown the impact multiplier is significantly positive.
Yes.
What would be the mechanism for impact multiplier?
Come again?
So what would be the mechanism for impact multiplier? Because I suppose then this explanation explains the dynamic
Yeah.
multiplier.
Well, honestly, the idea here is that you do have some slack in the economy, and when the demand increases, that increases aggregate output. But that won't be sustained if you don't have supply responses. So that's the idea, that you're not producing at the production possibility frontier, there is some slack. And if there's an increase in incomes, there is an increase in the total demand for agricultural product, hence total product.
So part of it is still the demand story, but then continues on with this
Yeah,
supply side.
yeah. And what we are basically seeing is that the supply side does explain quite substantial amount of the multiplier, especially after the second year.
For them to work in the first year, I'm just worried about the timing, like you just can't produce an agricultural crop in an instant.
Yeah,
It takes some time.
Yeah. No, I agree. The only thing is that you do have quite a lot in stockpiles and reserves as well.
Stockpiles, okay.
And what you're essentially registering is the overall value added. So that may change immediately as well.
I'm not sure about any, but many developing countries, the storage of grain is very poor.
Yeah.
It's very high.
It is. It's the same in India as well. But again, yes. So you can't have a sustained impact without supply side effects. That's it, actually. What's the conclusion? We use narrative analysis to identify local exogenous fluctuations in transfer spending. The multiplier is estimated to be 1.4 on impact, which increases to 2.1 after 5 years. And when we contrast with the broader measure of changes in transfer spending, that yields multiplier estimates that are an order of magnitude smaller. Overall, we attribute the multiplier effects to be due to agricultural productivity and due to increase in rural incomes. What are the policy implications? Well, the first would be that what we understand from this discussion is that transfer spending or rural transfer programs are an effective way to deal with local shocks. And this is essentially what I'm saying is not to spend more. What I'm saying is that you can achieve better outcomes locally by redistribution. You have a particular budget and you do redistribution within states, and that can actually alleviate local shocks. Again, we are not contending that you should take money out of infrastructure programs into welfare schemes, because I've had some issues motivating that in some seminars, so we're not debating that. We don't find any evidence for cross-border effects. I have not discussed that today, but in the paper we have, and we don't find any sectoral or spatial cross-border effects. What that means is that these gains are quite insular. Okay, don't have multiplier effects leaking out or being over-reported because the increase in economic activity in some other state is increasing economic activity in your state. Finally, the flip side is that cuts in transfer spending at the aggregate level can actually lead to large variations in the extent of retrenchment at the local level. It's the flip side. What that essentially means is that that can result in significant variation in the local economic activity, which is a serious unintended consequence of cutting down welfare and transfer spending that should be noted as well.